The kind of cold that cut through layers of fabric, seeping into bones like an unwelcome guest. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional rustle of discarded papers caught in the wind. Streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. He walked with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his breath escaping in small clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. It had been a long shift, too long. The weight of exhaustion clung to him, his body moving on muscle memory alone. The city was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic tapping of his own footsteps. Then, he heard it. At first, it was so faint that he thought it was just the wind, whistling through the alleyways. A sound so fragile it barely seemed real. But there it was again, a cry, weak, desperate. He stopped. His heart knocked once, hard, against his ribs. The kind of sound that instinct recognizes before logic catches up. He turned his head toward the alley to his left. It was dark, too dark, a place people ignored, a place where things were thrown away and forgotten. He took a step forward, then another. His breath felt heavier now. Something about this was wrong. The cry came again. His pulse quickened. His boots crunched against the thin layer of snow as he stepped off the sidewalk and into the shadows. The alley smelled of damp concrete and the lingering stench of garbage, but beneath it, something else, something raw, something human. And then he saw it, a bundle, small, unmoving. For a fraction of a second, he couldn't breathe. He closed the distance in an instant, kneeling beside the bundle, hands fumbling to pull back the thin, almost translucent fabric that barely covered it. And there, beneath the meager cloth, was a baby, tiny, fragile. The infant's skin was an unnatural shade of pale, its lips slightly parted, releasing feeble, gasping breaths. Its eyes fluttered weakly, unfocused, as if the fight to stay awake was already slipping beyond its grasp. His hands shook as he reached down, pressing trembling fingers against the baby's cheek. Ice cold. Too cold. His mind roared, shoving away the fog of exhaustion. Who would do this? He looked around, scanning the alley for any sign, any hint of someone nearby. A mother? A father? Someone lurking in the shadows, watching? Nothing, just silence. The city moved on around them, indifferent, oblivious. He swallowed, his throat dry as he scooped the baby up, pulling it close against his chest. The small body barely stirred. It should have been wailing, screaming, but instead, it was fading, slipping. Number, not tonight. Not like this. His legs moved before his mind could keep up. He turned, breaking into a sprint, his feet pounding against the frozen ground. Time was running out. The decision to save the baby. The weight in his arms felt impossibly light, yet it carried an unbearable heaviness. A life, barely holding on. A fragile thing, caught between existence and oblivion. He pressed the baby closer, his coat shielding the tiny body from the cruel night air. The child's breath was shallow, wisps of warmth barely noticeable against his skin. Fingers, so impossibly small, twitched slightly, then went still. A cold fear wrapped around him, squeezing his chest. He had seen death before. He knew how it crept in, quiet and patient, taking its time, waiting for the exact moment when it was least expected. Not this time. His grip tightened. His feet moved. Slow at first, then faster, boots slamming against the icy pavement. He didn't stop to think, didn't stop to wonder how his life had changed in an instant. He only knew that stopping wasn't an option. The streets blurred past. Streetlights, car headlights, the occasional distant face turning toward him, puzzled by the sight of a grown man running with desperate urgency. But no one stopped him. No one asked questions. The hospital was still blocks away, too far. He pushed forward, lungs burning, legs screaming. The night stretched long before him, the distance stretching impossibly, as if the universe itself conspired to keep him from getting there in time. The baby barely moved now. No, no. A hand reached up, trembling toward the tiny face. Skin like porcelain, so cold it felt wrong. A sharp pang of panic surged through him. Was he too late? The world shrank. There was no city, no street, no night. Only this child. Only this moment. And then, light, bright, blinding. The hospital doors ahead, glowing like a beacon. His legs almost gave out as he burst through, the warmth inside shocking against the icy air clinging to him. A nurse turned, startled. Her expression shifted in an instant, from irritation to alarm, as she saw what he carried. "Help!" his voice rasped, barely more than a breath. Then the hands of strangers took the baby from him, moving with the precision of people who had done this before. The weight left his arms, but the burden in his chest remained, heavier than ever. The doors swung open, closing behind them, and he was left standing there, frozen, breathless, waiting for a fate he could no longer control. Minutes passed. Then a doctor appeared, a man with sharp eyes, a furrowed brow, and a look that carried more meaning than words ever could. "If you hadn't found her when you did," the doctor said, voice steady but grim, "she wouldn't have survived the night." The world tilted. He exhaled, long and slow. The baby would live. But questions, so many questions swirled in his mind. Because someone had left that child to die, and someone somewhere had to answer for it. The waiting stretched into days. Questions were asked, forms were filled, calls were made. But no one, no desperate mother, no worried father, no long-lost relative, came forward to claim the child. She had been abandoned, officially, legally, completely. And so the system moved forward. Papers were drafted, signatures requested. Discussions about foster care were held behind closed doors, where decisions were made by people who had never held her in their arms, never felt the fragile heartbeat beneath ice-cold skin on a night when she had nearly been lost. The thought of handing her over, to strangers, to uncertainty, settled like a weight inside his chest. He had no roadmap for fatherhood, no carefully laid plans. But some things weren't planned. Some things simply became. And so, the decision was made. With the stroke of a pen, she was his. The shift was gradual, quiet in its enormity. Night after night, he sat by her crib, watching her breathe, feeling the fragile rise and fall of her tiny chest. Every whimper, every small sigh, every restless twitch. He was there. He learned the way she curled her fingers into his shirt when he held her, how she refused to sleep unless she heard his voice, the way she searched for him even before she understood who he was. He wasn't just raising her, he was saving her. The nights were long, sleepless. He worked, then came home to a child who didn't understand schedules, who cried through the exhaustion that neither of them could escape. He learned to function on fractured sleep, moving through the motions of his old life, while a new one quietly took its place. Then, the small moments began. A hesitant giggle, a pair of bright, wide eyes locking onto his, filled with something unfamiliar, trust. The tentative grasp of tiny fingers wrapping around his own. He named her Emily, and from that moment, she was his daughter. She grew. The days turned to months, then years. Her first steps, uncertain, wobbly, filled with sheer determination, sent his heart pounding in a way he hadn't known was possible. The first time she fell and scraped her knee, she didn't cry for an absent mother she had never known. She cried for him. And he was there, always. He taught her how to ride a bike, steady hands holding onto the back of the seat as she wobbled, then steadied, then soared forward, laughter bursting from her lips. He cheered louder than anyone at her first school recital, clapping as if the universe had tilted on its axis, to witness that single moment. Dinners were filled with stories, his from work, hers from school. She talked with the kind of unfiltered wonder only a child possesses, wide-eyed and eager, her hands always in motion. And at night, when the house grew quiet and the world outside faded into stillness, she would curl against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the sound that had always been there, even before she understood its meaning. She never asked why he had chosen her. She never had to, because deep down, she already knew. It started as a whisper, a thought that came and went, like a shadow passing behind frosted glass. There, then gone. A question she had never dared to ask, an answer she had never been given. For years, she had lived in the certainty of love. It had been enough. It should have been enough. But then came the gaps. Little things, things that didn't fit. A missing baby photo, a family tree project at school that required names she didn't have. The way his expression would shift, just slightly, whenever the subject of her early years was mentioned. She told herself it didn't matter. But the whisper grew louder. At first, she ignored it. She buried herself in the ordinary, the rush of college, the pull of friendships, the steady hum of routine. But curiosity doesn't die when it's silenced. It waits. And one evening, while searching for an old book in the attic, she found something else, a box. Not hidden, not locked away, but not in plain sight either. It was light in her hands, its edges worn soft with time. She hesitated before lifting the lid, an odd sense of hesitation creeping over her skin. Inside, yellowed papers, an old hospital bracelet, a faded photograph. She recognized none of it, and yet somehow it belonged to her. The bracelet bore a name she didn't know. The papers had words she couldn't make sense of. The photograph, a tiny, swaddled infant, was the only thing that made sense. Her. And suddenly, the whisper became a roar. She had spent her whole life looking forward, never questioning the past. But now, she couldn't escape it. The answers had always been there, waiting in the silence. She needed to know. That night, she sat across from him at the dinner table. The weight of the years sat between them, heavy and unspoken. And then, slowly, deliberately, she placed the DNA test kit on the table. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. His hands stilled. His eyes, always warm, now held something else. Something she had never seen before. For the first time in her life, she watched him hesitate. And in that hesitation, she found the truth she had always feared. There was something he wasn't telling her, and she was done waiting to find out what it was. It had been weeks, weeks of waiting, weeks of second-guessing, weeks of wondering if she had made a mistake. The test had been easy, a simple swab, sealed in an envelope, dropped into a mailbox. The hard part had come after, the silence. She had expected answers to come quickly. She had expected certainty. Instead, she got time. Too much time. Time to think, to doubt, to question what she would do if the truth was something she wasn't ready for. But the truth doesn't wait for readiness. It comes when it wants. And on a night like any other, with the hum of her laptop filling the quiet space of her bedroom, it came for her. The email arrived without ceremony. No dramatic music, no flashing lights. Just a subject line. Your DNA results are ready. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, fingers curled slightly, hesitating. She had spent years living without this knowledge. What was another minute? But she had come too far to stop now. She clicked. The screen loaded slowly, as if stalling, as if the universe itself understood the weight of what was about to be revealed. Her breath caught in her throat. The heartbeat in her ears drowned out everything else. Then, a match. Not just a distant cousin. Not just some long-forgotten relative in a database of strangers. A direct connection. A woman. A name she didn't recognize. A face that stared back at her, frozen in time. Her eyes red-rimmed, her lips slightly parted in an expression of something between hope and devastation. And beneath the image, 4 words that sent a shiver through her bones. Searching for my daughter. Everything around her dimmed. The screen was the only thing in focus, the glow illuminating her face as she read the words again and again, as if repetition could soften their impact. Her daughter. She was someone's daughter. The thought should have been obvious. Of course, she had come from somewhere. Of course, someone had carried her, given birth to her. But that person had always been faceless, a concept rather than a reality. Now, she had a name, a voice that had been calling out for her for 22 years. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on her shoulders, wrapping around her lungs. She felt weightless, and yet unbearably heavy, as if something inside her had shifted, realigned itself into something unrecognizable. Questions swarmed her mind, fighting for dominance. Why had she been left? Had this woman abandoned her, or had something else happened? Had she been wanted? Had she been loved? She didn't realize her hands were shaking until she reached for her phone. She could end this mystery right now. She could press a button, dial a number, hear the voice that had been waiting for her all these years. But she didn't move. Not yet. Because with every answer came more questions. And something told her that the truth was going to be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The past does not vanish. It lingers, in memories, in regrets, in moments that never fully disappear, no matter how much time stretches between them. For her, the past lived in a single night, a night that had stolen everything. Lisa had been 16, young, but not naive. She had known love, or at least what she thought was love. She had whispered promises under the stars, held onto words that should have meant forever. But forever had unraveled too quickly, and before she had time to understand what was happening, she had found herself standing in front of her parents, hands clenched, stomach twisted, heart pounding, pregnant. The word had hung in the air between them, thick and unmoving. Her father had not spoken. Not at first. He had stared, his face unreadable, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. Her mother's lips had pressed into a thin line, her eyes wet but cold. And then, the decision had been made. Not by her, never by her. They said she would bring shame. They said she would ruin her future. They said she was too young to make choices, yet old enough to suffer the consequences. She had pleaded, begged, cried, until her voice was hoarse. None of it had mattered. The night she gave birth was the longest of her life. The pain came in waves, unrelenting, pulling her under, forcing her body to do what it had been designed to do. She remembered gripping the sheets, biting down on her lip to keep from screaming, afraid that if she made too much noise, they would take something else from her. Then silence. For a brief moment, there had been peace, and then she heard it. A cry, small, fragile, the sound of a life she had created, her baby. She had turned her head, desperate to see, to touch, to hold, but hands, cold, firm, pressed her back. She fought. She tried to rise, reaching out, fingers trembling, but her mother's voice cut through the chaos. "It's over." She remembered looking into her father's eyes, searching for something, anything that resembled mercy. There was none. Then the doors swung open and her child was gone. The room had felt empty after that. Too large, too quiet. The pain in her body was nothing compared to the hollowness settling inside her chest. She had begged to see her baby. They had refused. The next morning, they told her the child hadn't survived, that it was better this way, that she needed to move on. She didn't believe them. Something inside her knew. A mother knows. But she had been 16, helpless, alone. And so she had carried that doubt with her, buried it deep, where no one could reach it. And yet she had never stopped looking. She searched in crowds, in playgrounds, in faces that seemed familiar but never were. Every year, on the same night, she lit a candle, for the child they told her was gone, for the life she had never been allowed to touch, for the baby who had never felt her love, until now. Now, her screen glowed in the darkness, illuminating words she had spent her life waiting for. DNA match found. Her breath hitched. Her hands, steady for 22 years, trembled as she reached for the screen, as she traced the name, the picture, the reality she had always known but had never been able to prove. Her daughter was alive. She had been alive all this time. Tears blurred her vision. A sob rose in her throat, breaking free before she could stop it. She had spent decades searching. Now, the search was over. But the fight to bring her home had just begun. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, the air crisp with the remnants of morning dew. The park stretched wide before her, its winding paths quiet, its trees standing like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. She sat on a bench, her fingers curled into tight fists in her lap, her pulse an unsteady rhythm beneath her skin. Emily had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Would she recognize her? Would she feel something, anything, the instant their eyes met? Or would the years of separation be too vast, the damage too deep? She didn't know. And yet, she was here, waiting. A single breath, a step, then another, and then there she was. Lisa stood at the edge of the pathway, unmoving. No grand entrance, no dramatic reveal. Just a woman, aged not just by years, but by loss, standing with her hands trembling at her sides. Their eyes met and the world stopped. For a moment there was no sound, no park, no time, just them. Lisa took a step forward, then hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came. Emily swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but no words felt right. Then, slowly, Lisa lifted a hand. A cautious movement, unsure, as though reaching for something that might vanish if she moved too quickly. Emily's breath caught, and then, as if pulled by something greater than herself, she stood. She took one step, then another, and suddenly there was no space between them. Lisa gasped softly, her hands moving to cover her mouth, her eyes glistening with something between disbelief and relief. Emily's heart pounded, her chest tightening as she stared at the woman in front of her, the woman whose face felt both foreign and familiar. Then, Lisa's voice, soft breaking, slipped into the air. "You're real!" The dam broke. Before Emily could think, before she could second guess, she was moving. And then, arms, warm, trembling arms pulling her in, gripping her as though letting go would mean losing her all over again. Lisa clung to her, fingers curling into the fabric of her jacket, her breath hitching as sobs shook through her. "I looked for you," Lisa whispered, her voice cracking. "I never stopped. I never stopped." Emily's throat burned. She had spent her entire life wondering where she came from. She had spent sleepless nights questioning whether she had been wanted, whether her absence had been noticed. And now, here she was, in the arms of a mother who had never given up on her. Tears blurred her vision as she buried her face into Lisa's shoulder, the scent of unfamiliar perfume, mixing with something deeper, something raw, something unspoken. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was enough. From a few feet away, David watched. He had known this moment would come, had felt the weight of it pressing against his chest ever since the DNA results had arrived. And yet, seeing it unfold before him, watching the daughter he had raised, the girl he had carried in his arms on a freezing winter night, now wrapped in the embrace of the woman who had given her life, left him standing still. A part of him had feared this, that this moment would make him irrelevant, that it would erase the years, undo the bond they had built. But then Emily turned. Tears still clung to her lashes, her breathing still uneven. But her gaze, steady, unwavering, found him. And in that gaze he saw it. Recognition. A silent promise. She stepped back, releasing Lisa with careful hesitation, before walking toward him. Then, without a word, she wrapped her arms around him. A deep sigh left his lips, and he let his eyes close for just a moment, because she had found her past. But she had never forgotten who had given her a future. Scene 8. The heartfelt conclusion. The house felt different that night. Not because anything had changed. Her books still lined the shelves. Her coffee mug sat in its usual place on the counter. The worn-out couch, where she had spent countless nights watching movies with David, still bore the familiar imprint of their time together. And yet, something was undeniably new. Emily stood in the doorway, the weight of the past few weeks pressing against her chest like a quiet, persistent whisper. The world outside was dark, but here, inside these walls, there was warmth. A kind of warmth that had always been there, even when she hadn't known to look for it. David sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a half-empty cup of coffee. He hadn't heard her come in. His eyes were distant, lost in thought, the lines on his face more pronounced than she remembered. For the first time, she saw something she hadn't before. Fear, not the kind that came from danger, not the kind that sent adrenaline surging through veins, but the kind that settled in slowly, quietly, when a person knew they were about to lose something they had spent a lifetime cherishing. She took a breath, stepping forward. The floor creaked beneath her weight. David looked up. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily swallowed, feeling the lump in her throat tighten. Then, without hesitation, she crossed the room, and she hugged him. Not the polite kind of hug people give out of obligation, not the hesitant embrace of someone unsure of where they stand. This was something else, something final, something unshakable. David's breath hitched as his arms wrapped around her, his grip tightening just slightly, as if afraid she might slip through his fingers. He had spent years protecting her, loving her, being her father. And now, he wondered if that had been enough, if she would still see him the same way, now that she knew the truth. Emily pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. Then, in a voice steady and certain, she whispered the words that would stay with him forever. "You will always be my dad. You're the one who stayed." David exhaled, a slow, quiet breath, as if those words had reached somewhere deep inside him and unlocked something he hadn't even realized he had been holding on to. And in that moment, he knew. No matter how much had changed, no matter how many questions had been answered, one thing remained the same. She was his daughter. Not by blood, but by something stronger, by choice, by love. The days that followed were not perfect. There were still things to unpack, still wounds that would take time to heal. But as Emily sat between David and Lisa, laughter filling the air, the weight of the past no longer felt quite so heavy. Because family wasn't about where you came from. It was about who held you up when the world tried to tear you down. And David, through every moment, every sacrifice, every silent act of love, had given her a life she never would have had. And for that, she would always be grateful.
If this story moved you, imagine how many others might need to hear it. Help us share more powerful stories by liking this video, subscribing to Rare Tales Unfold, and turning on notifications. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who needs a little hope today.